a privilege to have you all join us. It's the 5th day of our webinar series, and we're so excited that since the first day till this moment, we've been seeing some very punctual faces, some persons who've been here with us all through, and we are very, very sure that the content you've been getting from the start of the webinar to this moment are content that would have been of value to you in terms of helping you understand better the concept of pharmacogenomics and precision medicine. Thank you so much for joining us. Without wasting our time, we'll be moving straight now to introducing our amazing speaker for today's session. Our speaker for today's session is no other person than the person of Chukwunonso Nwabufo, and I'm going to be moving straight to reading his biography now, and we would be moving straight to the session so that we'll have enough time for questions and answers. And as I read the bio, I'd like to see the energy in the room. I'd like us to welcome our speaker warmly. I would want to see the emojis and the strong energy in the room. Okay, Chukwunonso Nwabufo is the founder of OneDrug Incorporated and a multiple award-winning translational pharmacologist with over 6 years of experience in drug development across academia and the pharmaceutical industry. Nwabufo contributed to the development of Remdesivir and Lenacapavir, approved for the treatment of COVID-19 and HIV, respectively, during his tenure at Gilead Sciences. He also contributed to the development of novel compounds under basic science research for the treatment and or diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. Nwabufo has received more than 20 awards and recognitions with over $400,000 in funding due to his academic, research, and leadership accomplishments. Nwabufo is the author of 18 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 11 industry standard peer-reviewed reports in support of drug development programs. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to see the excitement in the room once again as I welcome and hand over the microphone to our amazing guest for today, Dr. Chukwunonso Nwabufo. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. The floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Destiny. I appreciate it. I'm just going to move over to share my slide. And then Not sure why it's not pulling up the, okay, wonderful, I see it now. Can you see my screen now?
Okay, yeah, it's coming up.
Awesome. And can everyone see my screen good?
Yes, it's okay.
Yes.
Awesome,
Yes, yes.
awesome. Thank you so much, Destiny. I think it's so important that we are discussing pharmacogenetics at a time like this, and so critical about the international perspective of this type of meeting, that there are people from India, I see people from Nigeria as well. I mean, there's no better time than to talk about the impact of genetics and how we respond to medicines as individuals, and really with what is happening around the world now. So there's enough reason to be excited about pharmacogenetics. There's also enough reason to really discuss it and see some of the differences in how we're experiencing pharmacogenetics in clinical settings across jurisdictions. So today I will be talking about implementing pharmacogenetic guided treatments in routine clinical practice. And this is both giving the perspective from the research that we conducted and published last year, and also what we know now, particularly in Canada and the United States. So some of the things that I will talk about in this presentation may not be particular or peculiar to your own jurisdiction or your own country, but I would like to hear people's experience from their own country. So as I talk about some of these numbers, if you have the stats about your own country, please put it in the chat. Or if you feel like, oh, we're doing it this way, please put it in the chat, because I am eager to hear about these differences in countries. But the study that we did last year and published was actually a global perspective, which covered, most of our respondents were from Nigeria and different parts of the world. But I don't think that we got enough respondents from India. So I'm actually eager to hear some of the perspectives that you guys have, either from clinical practice or from your own experience as a patient. But it's really my hope that at the end of this presentation, you will see that the most significant obstacle to the clinical implementation of pharmacogenetic testing are the lack of knowledge and insufficient resources, and that potentially a point of care testing device could help improve the clinical implementation of pharmacogenetic testing. So I want to share this terrible story that happened, I think, about 2 years ago here in Ontario. So I'm actually from Canada at the University of Toronto and also at OneDrug. So Dr. Anil Kapoor is a well-known kidney transplant specialist, has strong international recognition, and was actually based out of McMaster University here in Ontario. But I think about 2 years ago, he was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. But doctors were very, hopeful that with treatment, he could get to spend more time with his family members because he had positive prognosis. So what they did was that they started him on treatment, and he was taking very popular anti-cancer drug that I think many of us would know, that I would not name here as well. But just after taking a single dose of this particular anti-cancer drug, he passed away. Just a single dose. I think it was about 3 weeks after taking this first single dose, he passed away. And further clinical investigation uncovered that he had a rare genetic variant that is known to affect this particular anti-cancer medicine. And doctors did not test him for this rare genetic variant. And so after taking just a single dose of an anti-cancer medicine that was supposed to help extend his life, the drug eventually killed him, and not even the stage 4 cancer that he had. So this is a classical example of what happens when drugs that are actually supposed to help patients extend their lives end up killing them faster than the disease condition that they have. And while we might think that Dr. Anil Kapoor's case scenario is just a rare case scenario, I think a study that was conducted at Stanford and was published in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics, I think in 2022, used UK Biobank, and it's still one of the largest pharmacogenetic studies that have been done so far. And they found that over 99% of the population in that UK biobank had at least one genetic variant that impacts how they will respond to medicines. Yeah?
I'm sorry, Dr. Chukwunonso. I'm sorry, but it seems the slides are not moving. I don't know.
What slide are you seeing now?
The first one, the very first slide, implementing pharmacogenomics guided treatment in routine clinical practice.
Oh, it's actually moving in my own end. I'm gonna stop and share again.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Can you see my slide now? Can you see my slide?
Now it's clear.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, you can see it now.
Okay. Is it,
On key takeaways.
did it advance on your own end now? Like it's,
Yeah, so the next slide, that's slide 2, key takeaways.
but I've actually advanced it from my end here.
Okay.
So you can only see key takeaways.
Yeah,
Okay. Can you see? What can you see now?
life-saving medicines can kill faster than disease.
So it seems like when I put it on presenter mode, it's not advancing. It's advancing, but then it's not advancing in your own end. Okay. What slide do you see now?
Medicines kill faster than
What about now?
this slide.
Okay. So I'm going to present using the
There must be internet issue.
non-presenter mode. Okay. But I think we all got to this place where I was talking about Dr. Anil Kapoor. Thank you so much, Destiny, for bringing this to my attention. And apologies for the technical glitch as well. But it's advancing in my own end. But I wanted to talk about a study that was conducted at Stanford University, I think was published in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics back in 2022. And it's still one of the largest pharmacogenetic studies that have been done so far that used UK Biobank. And what they found was that over 99% of the patient population in that study had at least one genetic liability that put them at risk of adverse drug effects. So it means that Dr. Anil Kapoor's story is actually, a clear representation of what is happening to most people around the world. And while his case scenario may not be, as severe, well, his case scenario is much more severe than perhaps the experiences that many of us or the people that we know have, it doesn't change the fact that it can happen to anyone. And you have to keep in mind that Dr. Anil Kapoor have always had this particular genetic makeup. It only came to light because he had to take this medicine and because it was untested for, and then ended up with this particular fatality. So there's every likelihood that individuals or people all over the world are walking around with very serious genetic liability, untested for, unknown for, that their clinicians are unaware for, that may become clinically relevant when they are presented drugs that are liable for that particular genetic makeup that they have. And while it might seem like Dr. Anil Kapoor's story is a very rare one, data coming from across the world is actually painting a much sadder scenario. Take the United States, for example. Studies have shown that on an annual basis, adverse drug effect causes more than 100,000 fatalities. Please keep in mind that when we are referring to fatalities, we are really referring to deaths, potentially similar to what happened to Dr. Anil Kapoor. And that on annual basis as well, adverse drug effect causes more than 1.3 million emergency department visits in the United States, with over $136 billion in annual healthcare costs. and it also ranks the 4th leading cause of death. So these are human beings, these are numbers, these are healthcare burdens. And before we think it's a United States flu, this problem is also present in Canada. In fact, studies have shown that on an annual basis, adverse drug effect causes more than 10,000 fatalities, with more than 2 million emergency department visits and over $13 billion in annual healthcare costs. And it also ranks the 4th leading cause of death in Canada. So that means that adverse drug effect is a pretty serious problem. It means we should take it as seriously as we would take heart attacks, cancers, and stroke. And we need to work, I think, even across jurisdictions to really change these numbers and improve significantly the burden of adverse drug effects on our healthcare system and even on individuals' lives. So I don't have the statistics of what's happening in Nigeria, for example, because it's not publicly available. But I just want to share with you right away that we have been conducting a study since 2022, and I'm happy to share that we are now progressing to actually submitting it, looking into the pharmacogenetic landscape within Nigeria to really see what is happening. And this has been a very collaborative effort, and I'm hoping that before the end of this year, the study will be published and we'll be able to share the data. Obviously, in some countries that have much more technological advancement, it's much more easier to assess some of this data compared to developing countries where those data are not readily available. But if you are aware, depending on where you're from, I've heard that there are people from India, from Nigeria. If you have any stats on what this scenario looks like in your country, please put it in the chat. Or even personal experiences that you may have had. It's important to really hear some of these stories. I have a TED Talk that I just gave recently in January, and I was surprised that after the talk, people, some people who attended the conference started sharing incidences that they have faced, or family members that they have lost due to the impact of one size fits all. So just moving on, why are we experiencing this adverse drug effects? The problem is that we are such a heterogeneous population. In fact, some countries or jurisdictions are more heterogeneous than others. I'm just going to give you a very quick observation that we, gathered from our study in Nigeria. Nigeria is actually much more heterogeneous. We have over 250 ethnic groups, and because of intermarriages, we end up, there's a concern of like, is it possible that there are unknown genetic makeups that we have not yet studied because of this diverse genetic pool? But the problem is you have this very diverse genetic pool, a heterogeneous population, but when people fall ill and they go to the clinic, they are viewed as a homogeneous population. Because a lot of the times when drugs are developed, we pick a sample from the population that is not essentially a representation of the particular population in question. And the other challenge as well is that depending on where the drug is developed, you may have underrepresentation of certain racial groups or ethnic groups that are unaccounted for. So essentially, drug development is often based on the one-size-fits-all. And even certain drugs that have black box warning on them for genetic liabilities, it is for the population that they know the genetic information. And so that's really a huge problem. So this is a problem as well in Western countries, that because of immigration, you have people from different ethnic groups, for example, that may have rare genetic variants that do not even fall into clinical guideline for testing, but have genetic liability with them, similar to the story of Dr. Anil Kapoor. So moving from a very heterogeneous population to treating a heterogeneous population based on sample-based findings that are not accurate representation of the general population, when you treat people based on that, what ends up happening is that some people will recover well. The anti-cancer medicine and the standard dosing that was given to Dr. Anil Kapoor would work well for most patients. However, some patients will not respond at all. And some other patients, just like Dr. Anil Kapoor, will end up with very serious adverse drug effects that can cost their lives and increase the burden on our healthcare system. And then you see all these huge healthcare costs. You know, we're talking about direct costs, but there's also indirect costs on both family members, on our workforce, when we lose lives of people like Dr. Anil Kapoor. But what can we do differently? What if we started recognizing that we're really a heterogeneous population? That's the fact. And when we start viewing people and the general population as a very heterogeneous population, when they come to health centers with health conditions like cancers and psychiatric disorders, we will first test them to identify their genetic makeup that is based on the particular disease condition that they have. So, for example, patients who have cancers, there are anti-cancer drugs. And a lot of anti-cancer drugs have black box warning on them. We know these genes that need to be tested for. Most of them are known. There are rare ones that we do not know. But at least we should start testing patients for these well-known and well-clinically characterized genetics or pharmacogenetic liabilities. And then we should expand our research base to even identify rare ones and validate their clinical relevance. Because when we test patients for this genetic makeup, it will now inform the drug that we prescribe to them and the dosing regimen that we give to them. And that's now personalized medicine. When we personalize treatments to patients based on their genetic makeup, we will achieve a win-win scenario. So those patients that would have responded well, fine and good, will still respond well. But patients like Dr. Anil Kapoor, who would have lost their lives because of genetic liabilities, will get to also respond well to treatment when we prescribe drugs to them based on their unique genetic makeup. So it is this science of matching drugs to patients' unique genetic makeup that's actually what we call pharmacogenetics. And the overall benefit of tailoring treatments to patients based on their genetic makeup is that we will help them recover very quickly. We will eradicate adverse drug effects, and we will also save on healthcare costs. I want to point out another important benefit that is not actually touched upon here. But one important benefit is that we will also improve the success of drug development programs. Just so you know, the reason why we have seen so much success within the oncology area is because of targeted therapy. And the reason for that is because the investigation of the pathological pathway of a lot of cancers reveals unique biological targets that are specific to the pathological pathway that also vary across individuals. And now, you now see many drugs that are being developed to target a specific protein that either has a particular genetic phenotype that vary across different patient populations. I want to cite an example for a particular anti-cancer medicine that was just, it's an antibody drug conjugate, and we wrote a paper on this back in 2023, mavituximab soravtansine, for advanced ovarian cancer. That drug received accelerated approval from the US FDA, but part of the reason was actually because of personalized medicine. So that means mavituximab soravtansine could have really been a potential drug that could have been removed from the market just because it was being tailored to the wrong patient population. But because of targeted therapy, and because they now understand advanced ovarian cancer very well, they recognize that this particular protein, folate receptor alpha, that the level of expression on this protein on the target site, that's in these ovarian tumors, varies across different patient populations. And that this antibody drug conjugate works very well in patients who are high expressors of this folate receptor alpha. For that reason, they approved mirvetuximab soravtansine for this small pool of patients with advanced ovarian cancer who are high expressors of folate receptor alpha. So for that reason, the drug was approved and also helped improve clinical outcomes for the management of patients with advanced ovarian cancer. And there were a lot of other conditions that was put in. For example, people who have been on, certain anti-cancer drugs for a while, first and both second anti-cancer medicine, who should be eligible for taking this particular medicine. But an important personalized treatment approach was recognizing that folate receptor alpha expression level is directly impactful in terms of the pharmacological activity of mirvetuximab soravtansine. So it can improve the success of drug development programs in addition to some of these other benefits that we have talked about. There are so many areas, I've given example based on oncology, but pharmacogenetics, make no mistake, can be applied across all therapeutic areas, virology, neurology, all of them it could be applied because, well, the pharmacogenetic liabilities that we are looking at are focused more on drug processing proteins and drug targets. So a lot of the times you're either focusing on the drug target, which is often proteins, or you're focusing more on drug processing proteins like drug metabolizing enzymes and membrane transporters. There's another area that is now of interest in my research work is also looking at disease pathways and seeing, for example, for immunology, looking at genetic driven differences on immunological responses. So that's another exciting area that is of interest to us. But for many of the drugs that are approved now, their focus is mostly on drug targets, on drug processing proteins, which may have genetic liabilities on them. So one area that quickly comes to mind that have gained so much attention, particularly in the Western world, are psychiatric disorders, and one of them is depression. So depression, as many of you know, according to the World Health Organization, have been reported to affect more than 200 million people all over the world. The interesting thing that a lot of people may not know is that the treatment of depression is often based on trial and error selection of antidepressants for patients. And for that reason, studies have shown that about 53% of patients with depression do not respond to the first antidepressant that is prescribed to them. 72% of these patients do not achieve remission. And in the United States, studies have shown that antidepressant-induced adverse drug effect accounts for 25,000 emergency department visits on an annual basis. So it is safe to say that, well, we can improve the success of all the management of patients with depression by personalizing or selecting antidepressants for patients based on their unique genetic makeup. Because studies have also shown that part of the reason why these patients do not respond to the first antidepressant prescribed to them is due to underlying genetic liabilities in about 40% of cases. And so it becomes very critical to think about how the genetics of these patients with depression impacts their response to antidepressants. And after all, human beings are not lab animals. So we should not really be doing trial and error of antidepressants on them when we know that underlying genetic liabilities can affect their response to antidepressants. So why don't we go ahead, first of all, and test them for these genetic liabilities? And the most interesting thing is that these genes, these genetic liabilities are well known and characterized. Very well known. In fact, many of you know CPIC. There's DPWG as well. In Canada, we also have our own in several jurisdictions, but CPIC is really the international one. So a lot of them are already characterized. The question is, why are clinicians not really testing patients for these genetic liabilities before prescribing antidepressants for them? Now, a lot of studies are now beginning to come up, and I'm just going to present two case scenarios here. In the United States, one clinical study that was conducted that looked at or stratified patients with depression into those who were treated based on their genetic makeup and those who were prescribed antidepressants based on the one-size-fits-all. Their study actually saw a significant increase in both response and remission rate in the patients group who were prescribed antidepressants based on their genetic makeup compared to those patient groups who were prescribed antidepressants based on the one-size-fits-all. So there is proof that treating patients with antidepressants based on their genetic makeup can indeed improve clinical outcomes, specifically looking at endpoints like response and remission rate. Another study was also conducted in Canada, and I think was published in 2022 as well. It's actually within our University of Toronto environment, was at CAMH, that they also conducted similar study where they stratified patients with depression into those who were treated based on their genetic makeup and those who were prescribed antidepressants based on the one-size-fits-all. And they reached similar conclusion, which is that prescribing or selecting antidepressants for patients with depression based on their unique genetic makeup significantly improves response and remission rate. In fact, this Canadian study went further to postulate that if only we could treat 50% of the 1.6 million Canadians with depression, if we could prescribe antidepressants for them based on their unique genetic makeup, we would save at least $2.4 billion. That's just depression, which falls into psychiatry. We've not talked about other psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, etc., etc. Just one disease condition, we've not gone across multiple therapeutic areas, and there's already potential savings of $2.4 billion. Another Canadian study even showed that when we treat patients based on their unique genetic makeup, we will save, there will be healthcare savings, we will improve the overall quality of life of these patients and the number of life years over 20 years. So there are multiple benefits or reasons why we should pursue treating patients based on their genetic makeup. This very influential paper that was also published in 2022 really started asking the same question that I think many of you, including myself, are already asking, is if we have this much evidence, if there's some level of evidence showing that genetics does impact response to treatment, then why is it still not implemented in routine clinical practice? And there's a lot of factors that serve as significant obstacles to the clinical implementation of genetic guided treatments in routine clinical practice. There's knowledge gap, there's education, and I think I will just present shortly in the forthcoming slide to show some of the findings that we documented from our own study back in 2023, 2024. There's knowledge and education gap. That means we know more about the impact of genetics on treatment or response to treatment right now, but it's still not in the curriculum of several medical and pharmacy schools. And I just want to ask, please put in your chat, put it in the chat here, if pharmacogenetics is already incorporated into your curriculum in the medical school or in your pharmacy school, please put it in the chat. I'm eager to hear and see how much of that has been implemented, because in the paper that we are just preparing to publish, we did a quick scan in Nigeria. I think we looked at the University of Nigeria, their pharmacy school and their curriculum, and pharmacogenetics was not there. We don't know whether that have changed or what that looks like. Even in the Western world, it's only recently that pharmacogenetics is coming into curriculum. The unfortunate thing then is that these are clinicians and healthcare providers that we're training who will go out there and treat patients, even though we have not equipped them with sufficient knowledge. There is also the aspect of teaching students in medical school and in pharmacy schools, but there is also continuing medical education. So we actually need to mandate that pharmacogenetics continues to be part of the curriculum as well. And in fact, there should be a certain number of credit units that healthcare providers should attain in order to maintain their license for medical practice, to demonstrate sufficient pharmacogenetic training. Because what we know about the impact of genetics on treatment is evolving every year. So it's important that when we educate patients in medical and pharmacy school, we should also incorporate pharmacogenetics training as part of their continuing medical education. There are still ethical and legal issues on genetic information, privacy, and aspects of that. And I think there's clarity on this in many Western countries as to disclosure of your genetic information and people who should have access to it. A significant problem that I believe both Western and developing countries are facing is testing costs and reimbursement. And I'll cite, for example, Canada, where we practice universal healthcare coverage, that up till now, this genetic testing is not covered by public healthcare funding. So this still is out-of-pocket cost for many patients, or through people who have insurance, or people who have maybe through employment, for example, who are able to undergo this type of tests through those type of coverages. So cost is still a significant barrier for patients who should test their genetics to see whether they have any underlying liability that can impact their response to medicine. Integration into electronic health records. So we are talking about portability of the test. So it's not that you did the test in one state and you move to another state and all of a sudden they don't have access to that. This is still a problem in developing countries too, portability of our health information. In fact, I think I attended a webinar where here in Ontario, hospitals that are close to each other, if you moved from that hospital to another hospital, the next hospital may not have access to your information. And this is a really huge problem. So what if a patient needs to be, it's in a very acute scenario and needs immediate treatment, and the doctor needs to see, what's their medical information, are there any underlying genetic liability before they prescribe any treatment? Well, they don't have access to that information, and they're not going to wait until that information becomes available. They will do the best possible thing to treat the patient. So portability of health information is important. Another one is incorporation into clinical practice guideline. I think CPIC is helping us put together this guideline. The question is, how many clinicians believe in CPIC guideline? CPIC guideline is there. Is it mandated? Are you required? Are there legal implications if you don't do that? So it's one thing for CPIC to have a guideline. It's another thing for there to be a mandate on incorporation and implementation. Is it standardized? Remember what I talked about, genetic pool, and think about what happened to Dr. Anil Kapoor. It's a possibility that they may have tested him for genetic liabilities. But maybe, as based on the story, he had a rare genetic variant that was untested for, meaning that there's a possibility that this rare genetic variant is not yet incorporated into clinical standards and regulations, even as black box warning. Talk about countries like Nigeria that have a very diverse genetic pool. My greatest concern is, are there genetic liabilities that are so rare that we have not yet researched and detected them in specific patient populations? And for that reason, it's still an unknown and an unidentified clinical liability or clinically relevant pharmacogenetic liability that have not even made its way to clinical practice guidelines. The other question is, okay, what sort of data is used in developing all these clinical guidelines? Is what is applicable in Canada, should it be applicable in the United States? What would that look like in a country like Nigeria, in India, etc., etc.? That's an important point. There's also that aspect of clinical generalizability. What about cost effectiveness? Well, I think it's pretty much clear. We can all see it here that we save more, because I think a number of people are arguing that, well, you know, doing this test does not actually save us money. There's evidence here that even if there is upfront costs with doing the test, the savings outweigh the costs. There's also uncertainty about clinical efficacy. This is another point. There are clinical studies that are coming out showing benefits, but there may also be other clinical studies that are saying that the benefits are not really very significant to warrant a change in clinical practice. Yes, all of this are a huge problem. But from our own end at OneDrug, we really feel that a lot of this problem can be tackled based on access. Access to testing devices means that we're eradicating costs. It means that we are also removing a bit of knowledge gap as well. Because if we have a tool that doctors can use to quickly test at the point of care, then we don't need to send samples to labs. And because part of the reason why labs are super expensive is because, you know, you require technical expertise, there's a backlog, and a lot of the times doctors need to make treatment decisions very rapidly at the point of care. You know, so what if we have a genetic testing device that is so easy to use that it now serves as a common use equipment in the hospital, which removes costs? Then perhaps we could move a little bit more closer to clinical implementation. So this is our stand at OneDrug and the way we view it. And so we started developing this standalone instrument along with custom test kits that are based off of well-characterized genetic liabilities that affect drugs for all these conditions, that is sampling result out that anybody can use at the point of care to quickly test samples and get an array of genetic liabilities that patients may have for specific therapeutic area, and then generate that result within 20 minutes. So we feel that if the hospital makes the purchase, and this is a one-time instrument and it's in their care, and it serves as a common use equipment at the point of care, we can eradicate the cost aspect that affects response or that affects clinical implementation. The other thing that we also thought about is that because we are using a software to operate the device and process the data, that it will give room for integration into electronic health record. And we can also incorporate all the clinical practice guidelines. Because the other problem that we feel clinicians may face, and if you're a clinician here, please put it in the chat as well. We want to hear from you. That one of the challenges clinicians may face is that, well, you've done this test, but what should I do with this information? That's a big problem. You know, yes, he has this, what should I do? Should I give them a different drug? And if yes, which drug should I give them? Or, well, if I'm to give them the same drug, how should I adjust the dosing? So that's still an important aspect. And even though this data is maintained with CPIC and sometimes in black box warning, they can be a little bit difficult to assess. You know, and at the point of care, clinicians, from what we have heard, really like accessibility. They really like information to be quickly available to them as they need it and to not have to struggle to obtain information. So we did a very nice study that was actually led by Guvia Kaur, who worked here at OneDrug. And the study was to identify obstacles. So basically validating some of our thought process on how we can address the challenges to the clinical implementation of pharmacogenetic guided treatments at the point of care. And what we did was that we developed these very nice survey questions that we distributed online. We had ones that were dedicated specifically to healthcare providers. These are doctors, pharmacists, specifically that we wanted to hear from. And then we wanted to hear from the general population, because we know that for change to be effective, in clinical practice, there has to be a synergistic agreement between patients and healthcare providers. It's one thing for doctors to want to conduct genetic testing and use that to inform patient treatment. If the patient says no, then you can't do anything. So we wanted to hear from both sides to identify what are their experiences, what are their perspectives? Do they think that genetic guided treatment can help improve clinical outcomes? What are some of the challenges and how do we address those challenges? And I put a reference to this paper here that you can actually look up online. We published this paper in Pharmacogenetics in Genomics back in 2024, and we were also invited to present it at the Pharmacogenomics Global Research Network that happened last year in Columbus, Ohio. Now we'll just go quickly to some of the important findings. So our healthcare providers that we spoke to, we got respondents from different parts of the world. And I just want to focus and draw your attention on this aspect because it impacts interpretation of the findings, obviously. For our healthcare providers, 83% of our respondents were from Africa. 10% of them were from North America, 4% from Europe, 3% from South Africa. So this is very important. So most of the responses that we got were from Africa, predominantly. When we asked these healthcare providers and we said, how familiar are you with pharmacogenetic testing in clinical settings? Only 16% of them were familiar with pharmacogenetic testing. When we now ask them, have you ever ordered pharmacogenetic testing for your patients? Only 4% of them have ever ordered pharmacogenetic testing. That's an important discordance. 16% were very familiar, but only 4% had actually ever ordered. And there are a lot of factors that, can be between that awareness and actual implementation. It could be that they're aware of it, they recommended it to their patients, and the patient said no. Or it could be that the knowledge does not actually translate to practice. They are not recommending it to their patients who should, in fact, undergo the testing. But we noted one thing very important, that there's a discordance between familiarity and actual implementation. And then we went on to ask them and we said, would you be more likely to implement genetic testing in your clinical practice if it was available through a reliable point of care device which could provide real-time testing? To our greatest surprise, 98% of these healthcare provider respondents said yes. That, you know what? I can implement pharmacogenetic testing in my routine practice if you gave me a device that could generate that testing result in real time. Which gets us a little bit more closer to some of our thought process that, maybe access is an important aspect. And then we went further to ask again, what challenges have you faced in incorporating pharmacogenetic testing into your clinical practice? Because we wanted to dive deeper to see, okay, now we know that, okay, maybe a point of care device will help you, but what are some of the other challenges? And the response was quite interesting. Again, keep in mind that majority of our respondents were from Africa. And we saw here that this was indeed a multifactorial, there were multiple factors that impacted clinical implementation. But the key factors here were limited access and availability to testing. 43 respondents pointed this out. Lack of knowledge was now the next factor. I don't know what's pharmacogenetics. And then uncertainty and lack of knowledge on how to interpret the result. 27 respondents pointed this out. If you remember the paper that I talked about previously that was written back in or was documented in 2022, these were all the factors that they actually talked about, and a lot of people, as I mentioned before, don't know how to interpret the results. So it's one thing to have access to do the test. What should I now do? How does this test help me improve how I treat my patient? Keeping in mind that doctors are actually much more careful because of legal implications. Just because you did a test and you saw that a patient has this particular genotype does not mean that you should go right away and then prescribe XYZ to them. So when it comes to scenarios like this, doctors want to be cautious due to legal implications. And then we then ask them, what resources or support do you think healthcare practitioners need in order to better understand and utilize pharmacogenetic testing? 70 of these respondents said comprehensive training, education on pharmacogenetic testing. So clearly there is education lacking. People, healthcare providers, as I mentioned before, it's a very nice paper that, I'm hoping before the end of this year should be out, that was focused mostly in Nigeria. It's not in the curriculum. And as I mentioned, even in Western countries, only now that pharmacogenetics is coming into the curriculum of a lot of medical and pharmacy schools. So we are not surprised that comprehensive education is really a huge aspect that is now impacting clinical implementation of pharmacogenetic guided treatments. And then the other one is access to user-friendly and universal pharmacogenetic databases. This is very important. I can actually understand this myself. There are multiple databases, but the question is, how does this apply to me across different jurisdictions? I can tell you, we assess those databases, and it's even difficult to assess. Even CPIC, if you go to CPIC database or website, it's still difficult to assess them. And for people who do not have molecular biology background or any genetics background, even understanding what is being said there is still very challenging. And then standardized clinical guidelines. This is a very important one. It's clinical practice guideline, but the question is, okay, should I do this in India? Should this, this clinical practice guideline was developed in the United States. Should I deploy it in India? Should I deploy it in Nigeria? That's an uncertainty that people don't know. So we need to standardize this. And maybe what I'm thinking is that we need to have jurisdictional standardization of clinical guidelines. And the reason for that is because, well, clinical guideline will always is developed based on the research that was conducted in that particular jurisdiction. And genetic pool significantly varies across jurisdictions. So it's important that when we are thinking about this clinical guideline, we should not use an internationally developed guideline that may not necessarily consider jurisdictional differences in genetic pool or maybe in research findings. And then after gathering this information from healthcare providers, we then started asking patients as well. And we said, and by patients, we are referring to the general public, of which doctors, that's healthcare providers, are also part of the general public because, they will fall ill and they will need care as well at some point. So we asked them and we said, are you aware of what pharmacogenetic testing is? And only 52% of our patient respondents were aware. I just want to disclaim here just again in the finding that this was an interesting twist. For our patient respondents, 84% of them were from North America. So this is really good that we're now getting healthcare provider perspective that is much more predominant in Africa. Now we're getting patient perspective that is predominantly North American. And then when we asked them and we said, have you ever undergone pharmacogenetic testing before? Only 4% of our patient respondents had ever undergone pharmacogenetic testing. But 52% of them are aware of pharmacogenetic testing. So again, we're seeing a huge gap between knowledge and actual implementation on both sides of healthcare providers and patients. And then we asked them, what are your overall feeling of pharmacogenetic testing? 13% of them, only 13% of them had very positive feelings about pharmacogenetic testing, with 51% being very neutral or unaware of, of what pharmacogenetic testing is. We then asked patients and we said, how much do you think a point of care device which provides real-time results could help with improving the accessibility and usefulness of pharmacogenetic testing for patients? And 71% of our patient respondents said, yes, a point of care pharmacogenetic testing device will significantly improve the implementation or the accessibility and usefulness of pharmacogenetic testing for patients. So doctors are saying yes, patients are also saying yes. And maybe what we may end up doing, we may end up with a scenario of glucose testing where patients now have access to point of care glucometers that they can use to quickly test themselves and even take the data to their clinician. So if if the device is so simple to use, then patients are also very open to using it, because they care for their own health. Would you be more willing to undergo pharmacogenetic testing if it were available to a reliable point of care device? 54% of our respondents said yes. So we see a synergy as well between patients and healthcare providers as it relates to both the gap between knowledge and implementation, as well as it relates to their perception on how pharmacogenetic testing via point of care device can help improve implementation. So we went further. We wanted to gather as much information as possible as we can from this very impactful data. So we wanted to see whether there was an association between awareness, patients' awareness, patients' awareness with pharmacogenetic testing and their overall feelings on pharmacogenetic testing in the future. And what we saw was that there was actually a positive association. The more aware a patient was about pharmacogenetics, the more prior awareness they had, the more positive they are feeling about pharmacogenetic testing. So that means that education and knowledge can actually help improve patients' willingness on undergoing the testing. That's from an implementation perspective. But we did not see any association between people, whether you have undergone pharmacogenetic testing before and your willingness to undergo pharmacogenetic testing in the future. And I think this makes sense because a lot can happen between the knowledge and experience you gather from time point S and your willingness to actually implement at a future time point. So these are very important findings that we have gathered from this data, and I want to say that we are still undergoing research, and we are seeking to hear from pharmacists and pharmacy managers. Specifically, we want to hear from them on how they think this pharmacogenetic testing device via point of care could improve patient care in their community pharmacy or in their place of practice. So if you're here, if you're a pharmacist, if you're a pharmacy manager, please scan this QR code and share your perspective. Because we now know, and as I think many of you also know this, who are clinicians or who practice, that knowledge is one thing, implementation is actually a big problem. And I think that in as much as there's a growing need to educate both healthcare providers and population and patient population on pharmacogenetics, well, education is only one aspect. There are multiple other factors that can impact implementation. And that's what we are trying to address from the pharmacist's perspective, because pharmacists dispense medications to patients. And I think that's really the point. At that point of care in community pharmacies could be when we can flag genetic liabilities to healthcare providers. So I'm just going to leave this here for a couple more seconds. If you have your phone, please scan, share your perspective. Please take a look at the honesty pledge and ensure that you're either a pharmacist or pharmacy manager before filling out these responses. Again, I want to be so eager to hear perspectives. So if you're here, please put it in the chat. If you're a pharmacist, if you're a healthcare provider, clinician, put it in the chat. Share your own perspective, share your own thoughts as well on how we can improve implementation and what needs to be done, both from a policy perspective and a healthcare perspective, a healthcare system perspective, to ensure that we improve clinical outcomes for patients by tailoring treatments to them based on their genetic makeup. So in conclusion, there is a gap between healthcare provider awareness of pharmacogenetics and practical application in routine clinical practice. We saw this we've seen it as well with Dr. Anil Kapoor's story. And there's also limited access to pharmacogenetic testing and knowledge gap are the major barriers affecting clinical implementation. It's important to point out here that this seems to be predominant in Africa, but I notify you that this is also applicable in Western countries as well. Just as I mentioned before, in Canada, where we practice universal healthcare coverage, pharmacogenetic testing is still not covered by public funding. So that access is still a problem here. The degree of that access or the degree of the problem or how significant that access will be is now dependent on socioeconomic power of the patient population. Patients that have much more money, who have much more economically stable, are more likely to pay out of pocket. Patients who have good social standing are much more likely to be more informed. So socioeconomic factor could also play a role here. Both healthcare providers and patients agree that a point-of-care pharmacogenetic testing will greatly enhance clinical implementation. We see this through our own study, both for healthcare providers and patients. We now want to dive deeper and see, well, are there factors that can affect the ability of point-of-care testing to advance clinical implementation? And what can we do to make sure that it actually comes to pass? So, and that future research should explore how point-of-care testing device can help overcome these complex barriers to clinical implementation. These are my references. I encourage you to read all of these papers as well, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Chukwunonso. It's been amazing. I want to see the energy in the room. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Very quickly now, we would move to the Q&A session. So we would have enough time for that. So I'll just go to the chat box now, and I think I see some questions there. I think we should start with those, and then I would move to taking questions by raise of hands. So I think the first question here is this: as pharmacogenomics is not currently part of the curriculum and there is lack of knowledge about pharmacogenomics testing and data analysis, what steps can we take to address this gap? Moreover, how can we raise awareness about personalized medicine and its benefits? That's from Mohammed Jan. Would you like to take the questions one after the other?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So the question is to just ensure that I get the question clearly. The question is, they're saying pharmacogenetics is not yet in their curriculum, correct?
Yes. And there's a lack of knowledge about pharmacogenomics testing and data analysis. So what step should be taken to address the gap? And how do we raise awareness about personalized medicine and its benefits?
Yeah. This is a very good point, guys. I think you should keep an eye on this paper because I provided an expert opinion on what I think needs to happen. Part of the reason why pharmacogenetics is not yet implemented in some countries is because, well, some of your instructors as well are not educated yet or not yet well trained on pharmacogenetics because it was not also in their own curriculum. And in some countries where pharmacogenetics training is not yet very solidified, the best approach could be to collaborate with foreign institutions where, they have that training, and through those collaboration, we can start building knowledge base in those countries where pharmacogenetics is not yet in their curriculum. Your role as a student could be to sign petitions from your classmates, for example, to show, because you are the consumer of the knowledge as well. You can sign petition and bring to your dean, to your administrators. The petition is not really a way to kind of like bring down the system. It's a way to show to gather numbers and show the numbers of students in your program who are interested in the course, who are interested in taking pharmacogenetics in their medical school or in pharmacy school. When that number is gathered, the leadership of that particular faculty or the faculty members can then start thinking about inviting guest speakers. I've seen this happen, for example. You can take that course as an ancillary course. In fact, some of you, they may have to hire someone who has good pharmacogenetics knowledge that will now become an instructor for that particular course. But again, for this to happen, there has to be, and there are multiple layers to this. Remember that for pharmacy and medicine, there are regulatory agencies. I think in Nigeria, there's Pharmaceutical Council of Nigeria, for example. They are the ones who set the curriculum for pharmacy education. So there has to be, if they have pharmacogenetics as a requirement in that curriculum, institutions will not have any choice but to offer it. So there are multiple layers of, that you need to go through to really impact that change from an education perspective. But as a student, for example, it could really be bringing it to the attention of your instructors, your professors, signing out petitions, for example. Also educating your own self too, because usually when they are not teaching people on that, it just means that expertise is still lacking within that jurisdiction. So there are multiple. This is just one way that I think, but we have a paper coming out on this where we provide specific strategies and how this can be addressed. And I think we focus mostly in Nigeria, but I think it's a model that even other countries who may be facing the same problem can also deploy the same strategy in addressing it.
All right, fantastic. I would move to the next question now. That's from Dr. Patricia Cavazola. Would you kindly share the link for the entire article of your work in pharmacogenetics and genomics 2024? I'm encountering a paywall.
Absolutely. I can put it here in the chat as well. So maybe we can go on with the questions and I will.
Fantastic.
Try to put it in the chat.
Okay, I think there's a question here from Ayman. From pharmacogenomics, can we recognize that a person is at risk of side effects, severe side effects?
Yeah, that's only feasible if the side effect is due to underlying genetic effects. Let's just break this down too. When we talk about adverse drug effects, gene-drug interaction is just one of the causes of adverse drug effect. But there's also drug-drug interactions that can cause this. There's also disease-drug interactions that can cause this as well. There's also medication adherence issue, patients who do not adhere to their medication, or wrong labeling, medication error. There are multiple other factors that can contribute to adverse drug effects. So genetics will not be the only one, but our focus today is really on the impact that genetics does have on how patients respond to medicine.
Okay, fantastic. I'll take the next one now. It doesn't seem this one is a question. This one is kind of like a contribution from Nosaba Omar. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. He says, I used to be a pharmacy trainee in Sudan. Unfortunately, pharmacogenetics method of treatment is never implemented, as even a simple test costs a lot. I feel like if it was supported more, people would be more encouraged to take these routes of treatment rather. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just going to respond to that. By the way, I just put the link to the paper in the chat here. The reality is, you might think this is only a problem in Sudan. It's not. It's also a problem here, even in Western countries, because a lot of the times this is out-of-pocket cost for patients. So it's a change that, see, the change is coming. It might take a while, but it's coming. As I mentioned, we are addressing it from our own perspective at OneDrug in thinking that if we have a simple portable device, that it can help reduce that access and cost barrier. My advice is so as not to add to the numbers and add to the statistics, where feasible, undergo the testing and encourage your patients, even if it's still not available, encourage your patients, advocate that they should still undergo the testing, and especially if they are maybe taking anti-cancer drugs or psychiatric medications. I think that knowledge, from a knowledge aspect, you still should be within your right to advise your patients and educate them on the impact of genetics on how they respond to medicines. And it would then be their choice and their economic power to determine whether or not they want to undergo the testing. But you're correct. The cost issue is a significant problem both in developing countries and even developed countries.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Chukwunonso. I don't know how much more questions do you think we could take?
I mean, we could take a few more. Or
Okay.
When does the session end? If there's another one starting, then maybe we can cut off, but I'm happy to still take a few more.
Okay, great. I think we still have some time, more than 15 minutes to go. So I'll take the next question now. I think this one is from Ragul. What are the key factors influencing the successful implementation of pharmacogenetic guided treatment guideline in routine clinical practice? I don't know.
Yeah, those are the things that we discussed. Remember the paper that I shared? There are multiple. It's not just one thing, but education is ranking high on the list. Comprehensive access to genetic clinical guidelines in terms of like how to adjust dosing, what particular gene to test for. The other one too is access to testing. You know, as I mentioned before, is one thing to know that you should test. It's another thing to actually be able to test. The other thing is the generalizability of the guidelines. So even though we have CPIC, does the CPIC guideline apply to India? You know, are there rare genetic variants in India or in Nigeria that we don't know about, right? So access, I think from our own finding, comprehensive education, limited access to testing, database and tools for interpreting the testing, those actually ranked high as factors that are affecting the clinical implementation. And of course, there is cost as well that we have spoken about.
Great. I'll take the next now. This is from Esiosa. How long do you think it would take for pharmacogenomics to be implemented after it has been added to the curriculum?
Well, I think the moment it's less about the curriculum, but I think it depends on what approved curriculum the Medical School Association for that jurisdiction have set in place. So say, for example, the Pharmacy Council of Nigeria, which I think sets the curriculum for pharmacy schools in Nigeria, meaning that's their expectation for you to be, you know, for a degree to be valid and for you to be licensed. I think if they were to implement it today, they will probably give like a time frame, because universities need to also change their own curriculum, hire staffs that will do that. So those agencies, you know, those professional associations will set those adequate guidelines to allow institutions also adapt to the changes in curriculum.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll take the next one now. Okay. I don't think I can see another one.
No, okay. Well, I want to thank you all so much for being in attendance.
Good afternoon.
Oh, yeah?
Okay, sorry. Musa, please, you can unmute and ask a question, please.
So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I don't know if I can pronounce it well, Mr. or Dr. Chukwunonso Chukwunonso. So this is very interesting, and I find it very fascinating, being an epidemiologist, but also a pharmacy technician. So I have seen the correlation between epidemiology and pharmacology here. And this brings me to the concept of pharmacoepidemiology, which, going by your presentation, you presented very well. You kind of bring more or less a KAP study where you look at the knowledge of the healthcare worker, the practice, but of course the attitude. So putting this into context now, particularly from where I'm coming from, the Gambia, where this concept is actually new or actually not even practiced, data becomes very, very much a problem. And when I started working as a regulator, I have been practicing as an epidemiologist all this while. But when I started as a regulator at the Gambia NRA, I tried to link surveillance into practice of drugs here. In doing so, you need some data. Assume the drug resistance, for instance, the advanced drug, and etc., etc. Are we reporting these things? If so, are we collecting this data? And if so, are we interpreting this data to inform policy? Right. We have various community pharmacies, public pharmacies, you have the hospitals, etc., and etc. So, and I tend to believe that anytime there is a adverse drug reaction or adherence or whatever, misuse, you tend to see that it is reported directly or indirectly. Assume I went to a pharmacy or a community pharmacy and then bought paracetamol. I went home, used it one day, twice, and then my condition is not improving. I come back to the same community pharmacy and explain to them that actually I bought this medication for this reason, but they are not improving. That is reporting. There is a reporting mechanism here. The person actually reported. But are we treating it as a report? Most of the time, no. We change to give alternate drugs, and then once that problem is solved, that's the end of the story. And these are information that are very valid, very informative, that can help us to come up with informed policies, and in fact, in a way of getting the right drugs for the right people. Coming to the gender, you look at drugs, advanced drugs versus the gender, advanced drug versus the age, advanced drug versus different communities or regions. So to me, this is very relevant. And I think if we really get deep into these things and all other countries start implementing these things, I think it can help not only the government, but individual as a whole. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Musa. You've pointed out a very important problem that this is also in the paper, by the way, that we are working on and looking at publishing. The reality is that what you're saying is the truth. It is the fact. I was able to present the data of what you saw in terms of adverse drug effects in the United States and Canada. And I think for so many other developed countries, you can easily find them, but we don't for many African countries. And the reason for that is that you're correct. A patient, and I know this because I lived in Nigeria as well, when a patient presents with an effect, or maybe they report that a drug doesn't work for them, well, the pharmacist typically finds a solution for them right away, but there is no effective reporting system, because that's actually an important information that the patient have shared with the pharmacist or with their healthcare provider. That should be documented. So let's use, for example, in Canada, we actually have a central adverse drug effects reporting mechanism, because it's all of this data that, you know, pharmaceutical companies and health regulators gather to now say, adverse effect is common in this particular medication. Let's find out why that is happening. But we don't have a standardized, we don't even, let me cite an example where we saw this in the paper that we're writing in Nigeria. We don't even have electronic health record in so many states in the country. So how are we don't have information about patients, you know. So it's a huge problem that I think in Africa at large, we need to do better at finding a mechanistic and very useful electronic documentation process, both for patients, but also a reporting mechanism. Because it's only when we start gathering this information, it's the information we get from the point of care. That's what we use to then do basic and translational research to kind of like find out, okay, what are the underlying issues? Why is this happening? And how can we address it? Western countries are ahead because they are documenting, they are reporting. Even if the reporting mechanism is not 100% efficient, we are still getting relevant documentation that is informing how things are being done. And it's also informing policy, by the way. What is policy? Policy is the black box warning that you're seeing in drugs that regulators will mandate drug developers to now put as a warning to healthcare providers. That black box warning is actually a very important thing, because if the black box warning says, do not give drug X to a patient that has this particular genetic makeup, and the healthcare provider gives that, the patient can actually bring up a legal action on them if they end up with serious adverse effects. They can take legal actions on healthcare providers. So we need to do more on that, because with medicine and science is evidence-based, and I know you know this as an epidemiologist, but the data is not just forthcoming, and it needs to start coming. We need to start having a way to kind of like document, and I'm emphasizing that it has to be jurisdictional. You know, Africa is a continent. Countries in Africa should start developing their own pharmacogenetics guideline, their own pharmacogenetics association. They should start maintaining their own database, because we know that there might be differences in genetic pool and clinical practices across jurisdictions in Africa. You know, I think that this paper will be super useful to you also. Keep an eye on it, because we did point out this fact as well. We saw this and we pointed it out as well in the paper.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this one is from Yasal Adamu. As an MSc biotechnology student, can I specialize in pharmacogenetics? That's the question.
Yeah, if your program offers it as an area of specialization, why not? Yeah.
Okay, it's what is the role of these pharmacogenes in establishing new treatments for many orphan diseases? That's from
well, orphan drugs are, or I would call them neglected diseases, are critical and also very important. I will say that genetics is helping us see. So listen, let me use the case of advanced ovarian cancer as an example. Even for a particular disease condition, there are different clinical presentations and pathological profiles across different patient populations. Using advanced ovarian cancer as example, and you can read the paper that we published in Cancer Pharmacology and Chemotherapy, you will see that, for example, patients with advanced ovarian cancer, there are some of them that express a particular protein known as folate receptor alpha. There are some of them that express it very well. There are some of them that do not express it that much. And that particular expression level plays a role in whether this antibody drug conjugate drug, mavitoximab soravtansine, will work well. But it's genetic surveillance. When they surveil the underlying genetic implications of the pathology, that was when they were able to find this particular target. And for that reason, they now developed this drug for a subpopulation of these patients who are more likely to benefit from it. And, you know, there are multiple other examples. So definitely for neglected diseases or for disease conditions that do not apply or do not affect a significant proportion of the population to warrant drug development attention from drug developers, It's also very useful to start doing genetic surveillance for those disease conditions to now see, okay, are there specific unique targets that have underlying genetic liabilities that can inform drug development? So yes, genetic liabilities can also inform orphan drug development.
Fantastic. So I'll take this one from Akiabasi. Please, how can I help in the ongoing research as a pharmacy undergraduate with research skills?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so in our group, for example, we have multiple researches that are ongoing. This one that we are finalizing, we actually started it since 2022. That's how long it can take sometimes to put such an impactful work together. I want to say that if anyone wants to discuss about potential involvement, I think Destiny has my email address and can pass that along for people who are potentially interested in getting involved. But there are also multiple pharmacogenetic associations. One of them is Pharmacogenetic Global Research Network that you could get involved in and work with them on research relating to pharmacogenetics.
Okay, I don't know if we'll still be able to take another question now. We have just about 3 minutes to the end of the session. Can I take the last question, sir?
Yeah, we can do one more and then we'll go.
Okay, great. This is from Amiru Lawal. As a veterinarian, I know that adverse drug effects do occur in animals as well as residual drug effects also do occur in human as a result of consuming or eating animal products like meats. How do you pharmacogenetics can be used in animal health?
This is actually quite interesting because we have not yet thought about this. But definitely, yes, animals, say for example, small animal models that are used in research, for example, rats, hamsters, mouse, they have their own genes as well. So yes, it can impact them. And we need to start testing for that as well. So in veterinary medicine, it needs to be looked into. Now we need to survey the literature as well to see how much work has been done in that particular area. I think the focus is mostly on humans because of clinical relevance, but for sure, it's worth looking into animals too to see how does their genetics impact response to treatments. I think with animals, a lot of the time, and I'm just using livestock as a case study here, I think antibiotics is typically what is administered to them. And I know last year there's a lot of interest, for example, coming in Canada reporting that the administration of antibiotics that were initially developed for humans, that administration of those antibiotics to livestock is actually contributing to antimicrobial resistance. Right. So I think, a lot of the times with livestock that antibiotics is what is typically administered to them. And the important thing would be to then start looking for, are there well-known drug processing proteins or drug targets that impact how antibiotics are processed. And the other thing too is keep in mind, the pathway a drug is processed in a human being may not necessarily be how it is processed in animals, in small animals like, rats, hamsters. And so if you identify that a particular gene is relevant, a particular protein is relevant to processing a particular drug in human beings, it may not be relevant in animals as well. So I think that's an area of interest. And again, people may not start looking at this until data is gathered. Which is the next question I wanted to ask, because this is very interesting. Are there unusual data that are now coming up within veterinary medicine that you think is of concern in terms of adverse drug effect that will warrant further investigation as to the role of genetics in contributing to that type of data within veterinary medicine? That should be worth looking into.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Chukwunonso Nwabufo. It's been an amazing time with you, and we are very grateful for your generosity and your willingness to share your knowledge on a global scale as it relates to pharmacogenomics. Thank you so much. It's been very, very great. We're going to be ending the session now, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for participating. And just to say, don't forget, we have another session tomorrow at day 6. That's on leveraging emerging technologies in pharmacogenomics. We have another amazing speaker who would be joining us to do justice to that topic. So do not forget to sign the feedback form, to fill the feedback form. We want to get your responses. We want to get your feedback and know what we could do to improve on the sessions. Thank you so much once again, everyone. It's been amazing seeing you all once again. See you tomorrow.